August 23, 1944. The English Channel, cloudless and brilliant beneath the summer sun. A woman in her 20s sat at a radar console in a fortified bunker near Dover, her eyes fixed on the green phosphorescent glow of a Type 1 early warning display. Her name was Catherine, and she had been watching German V-1 flying bombs materialize on her screen for weeks now. Helpless blips advancing across the electronic horizon toward the civilian cities of southern England. The experience had become routine in its horror. Watch the target appear, alert the gun batteries, watch the shells rise into the blue sky, watch most of them miss. She had learned to count backward from 10, knowing that after 10 seconds she would see the blip continuing unimpeded toward London. But on this particular afternoon, something fundamental changed. The V-1s began to vanish. Not all of them. Some still made it through. But an unprecedented percentage simply ceased to exist before reaching the inner defense perimeter. Catherine watched in amazement as engagement after engagement resulted in kills. Not the occasional victory followed by 9 failures, but consistent, methodical destruction. By the end of that day, 82 of the 104 flying bombs that had crossed the English coast had been shot down. A kill ratio that seemed impossible. A kill ratio that violated everything the gun crews had learned about anti-aircraft warfare. Over 4 years of devastating failure. Catherine did not understand the mechanism. She saw only the results. What she was witnessing was the most revolutionary transformation in artillery effectiveness in the history of warfare, and it was about to be revealed to German commanders in the most devastating way imaginable, through the evidence of their own weapons' failure. The journey to that August afternoon began 5 years earlier. In a scientific laboratory in Silver Spring, Maryland, where a small group of researchers had gathered to solve a problem that every military power had declared impossible. The problem was simple to state and impossibly complex to solve. How could an artillery shell be made to detonate when it came close to an enemy aircraft, rather than requiring a direct hit? Every day in the Second World War, thousands of anti-aircraft shells flew toward their targets and missed. The shells fell to earth or disappeared into the ocean, their high explosive charge wasted on empty sky. Timed fuses existed, but they were crude instruments. A gun crew would estimate the altitude of an approaching aircraft, estimate its speed, perform rapid calculations, and set a fuse to detonate at a theoretically optimal time. The mathematics were imprecise. The variables were too many. Small errors in calculation resulted in shells that detonated too early, spreading shrapnel harmlessly through open sky, or too late, allowing the shell to bury itself in earth and lose all killing power. The result was devastating inefficiency. Sometimes thousands of shells were required to bring down a single aircraft. The British had conceived of the theoretical solution in 1940, a device that could transmit and receive radio signals mounted inside an artillery shell that would measure the distance between the shell and its target and detonate when that distance reached an optimal value. The device would have to be miniature, fitting into a space scarcely larger than a pint milk bottle. It would have to survive accelerations of 20,000 times normal gravity when the shell was fired from a cannon. It would have to function perfectly while the shell spun at 25,000 revolutions per minute. And it would have to do all of this using vacuum, tubes, and electrical components that were notorious for their fragility. The British shared their preliminary concepts with the Americans during the teasered mission in 1940. American scientists, including Dr. Merle Tuve at the Carnegie Institution's Department of Terrestrial Magnetism, recognized the military significance immediately and began developing what would become known as Section T, a secret research group dedicated to creating a proximity fuse for artillery shells. By 1941, the group had moved to Johns Hopkins University's newly established Applied Physics Laboratory in Silver Spring, Maryland. There, surrounded by the most brilliant electronic engineers and physicists America could assemble, a race began against the apparent laws of physics itself. The challenge seemed insurmountable. Vacuum tubes could not survive the forces generated by artillery. Electronics could not be miniaturized to the required dimensions. Batteries could not be designed to operate in extreme temperatures and high altitudes. Yet necessity, and the prospect of defending American ships in London from air attack, demanded that these impossible obstacles be overcome. In 1941, a young physicist named Dr. James Van Allen joined the proximity fuse team. Van Allen would later become famous for discovering the radiation belts that surround the Earth, belts that would bear his name for generations. But in 1941, he was simply a brilliant young scientist confronting the problem of creating vacuum tubes that could withstand acceleration forces no vacuum tube had ever been designed to withstand. His breakthrough came from an unlikely source, a Massachusetts company that manufactured hearing aids. That company had already developed miniaturized vacuum tubes for hearing aid amplification. These tubes were dramatically smaller than conventional radio tubes, but they had never been tested in extreme acceleration environments. Van Allen approached the hearing aid company and proposed collaboration. For 6 months, he worked with their engineers, developing progressively more rugged tube designs. The standard vacuum tube used fragile tungsten filaments suspended from delicate wires. When acceleration forces were applied, these filaments would tear free from their mounts, destroying the tube's functionality. Van Allen's innovation was radical in its simplicity. Replace the delicate suspended filament with a rigid support structure. Instead of hanging filaments that could vibrate and tear, create a mechanical structure where the filament was braced and supported as rigidly as possible. In January 1942, Van Allen developed what became known as the mousetrap spring, a mechanical innovation that would remain classified as secret for 5 years after the war. The mousetrap spring consisted of a precisely designed mechanical structure that protected the tube's filament during the crushing acceleration of being fired from an artillery piece, then released the filament to its normal operational position once the shell was in flight. The design was elegant in its simplicity, devastating in its effectiveness. With this breakthrough, the vacuum tube problem had been partially solved. But the proximity fuse required far more than simply surviving acceleration. It required a complete miniaturized radio system packed into a device smaller than a coffee can. The transmitter had to generate continuous radio waves at precise frequencies. The receiver had to detect reflections of those waves bouncing off metal targets. The amplifier circuits had to strengthen weak reflected signals into usable electrical impulses. A thyrotron tube had to sense when the reflected signal reached a critical threshold and trigger a detonation circuit. A battery had to power all of these components continuously without leaking, without failing across temperature extremes. The challenge of producing working prototypes was matched by an even greater challenge, producing 50,000 of them daily at peak production. The entire project required the cooperation of 110 American factories, employing more than 1 million workers at its height. Sylvania Corporation dominated the production of vacuum tubes, operating 15 separate plants with 10,000 workers, 90% of them women, producing more than 100 million miniature vacuum tubes. These workers, mostly female, many recruited from local communities and agricultural backgrounds, performed repetitive tasks with extraordinary precision. At the Sylvania plant in Ipswich, Massachusetts, workers used microscopes to verify that components were installed to tolerances of 1/20,000th of an inch. They worked in climate-controlled clean rooms with filtered air, each worker typically performing one specific task thousands of times per shift. They had no concept of what these tiny components would eventually accomplish. They simply worked with meticulous precision, understanding only that their labor was classified as essential to the war effort. By the summer of 1943, the first proximity fuses had been tested in combat. On August 8, 1943, the USS Cleveland fired at Japanese aircraft using proximity-fused shells. 3 aircraft fell from the sky before they could release their ordnance. The kill ratio was extraordinary. Within months, American naval vessels equipped with proximity fuses were achieving kill ratios that seemed to violate the mathematics of anti-aircraft warfare. The advantage was so significant that the United States restricted the use of proximity fuses to combat zones over water. The fear was real and paralyzing. If a proximity fuse fell into German hands and was reverse-engineered, Germany might duplicate the technology and use it to devastate American bomber formations over Europe. The prohibition on using proximity fuses over land would remain in effect until June 12, 1944, when the first V-1 flying bombs began their terror campaign against London. The V-1 was a pilotless flying bomb, a cruise missile in everything but name. It resembled a small airplane with a stubby fuselage and short wings. A ramjet engine in its tail provided thrust. An autopilot maintained heading and altitude. The V-1 flew at approximately 150 miles per hour, Too fast for most anti-aircraft guns to track accurately, too slow to escape from fighter aircraft if they could reach it in time. The Germans had launched approximately 9,300 of these weapons against England between June and the end of August 1944. The initial response from British anti-aircraft forces was devastation. In the first week of the V-1 campaign, only 17% of the flying bombs that penetrated the British coastal gun belt were destroyed by artillery. 17%. Even as the gun crews worked frantically to improve their tactics, even as they moved their positions and refined their targeting, success remained marginal. The V-1s were simply too small, too fast, and too numerous. The mathematics of conventional anti-aircraft warfare broke down completely when the target was a pilotless drone incapable of evasive maneuvers, but equally incapable of being rattled or frightened. In desperation, the Americans authorized the British to use proximity-fused shells in defense of London, beginning on June 12, 1944. At first, the effect was barely perceptible. Kill rates rose from 17% to 20%, then to 30%. The ammunition was new to British gun crews. They had not trained with it. They did not trust the technology. Some gunners assumed the proximity fuse was simply another gadget that would fail at the critical moment. But as the technology proved itself, as shell after shell detonated at precisely the optimal moment to destroy its target, belief replaced skepticism. Kill rates climbed to 50%, then to 60%. By August 23, 1944, the kill rate had reached 82% on a single day. 104 V-1s crossed the English coast. 82 were destroyed before reaching their targets. The efficiency had multiplied more than 100-fold. Where previously it had taken approximately 2,500 shells to destroy a single V-1, the proximity fuse had reduced that requirement to 100 shells. The mathematics of lethality had been utterly transformed. The gun crews who had spent 4 years watching their shells miss, watching anti-aircraft warfare become an exercise in futility, suddenly found themselves achieving victories. The transformation was more than statistical. It was psychological and emotional. Men who had grown accustomed to failure, to expending ammunition with minimal results, suddenly discovered that their work mattered, that their gunnery accuracy translated into actual victories. Experienced anti-aircraft gunners, who had fired hundreds of thousands of shells, with meager results watched in amazement as their colleagues with proximity-fused shells consistently destroyed targets with just 2 or 3 rounds per engagement. The German response was confusion initially, then dawning horror as the scope of the V-1 destruction became undeniable. German intelligence services attempted to analyze the cause of the unprecedented kill rates. Early theories blamed improved British radar-directed gunnery. The radar had indeed improved dramatically, with new centimeter-wave systems based on the cavity magnetron allowing precise target tracking. But even radar could not account for such dramatic improvements in gunnery effectiveness. Captured American shells began arriving at German technical facilities in the early months of the V-1 campaign. Most shells were complete catastrophic failures, their explosive warheads detonated by impact or fragmented beyond recovery. But occasionally a shell would fail to detonate completely, burying itself harmlessly in earth or water rather than exploding. German ordnance specialists would carefully extract these duds, recognizing immediately that they contained something extraordinary. When engineers at technical testing facilities opened the first intact proximity fuse, the moment was as consequential as the discovery of the walkie-talkie had been in the previous year. Inside the shell lay evidence of miniaturization and integration that seemed impossible. According to German technical understanding, the fuse assembly occupied barely 4 cubic inches of space, less than the volume of a typical beer glass. Within that tiny volume were housed 4 vacuum tubes, precise electronic circuits, a battery, and a sophisticated detonation mechanism. The transmitter generated continuous radio waves at approximately 180 megahertz. The receiver detected reflections of those waves. The amplifier circuits boosted weak reflected signals. The thyrotron tube provided the trigger for detonation. The entire system was ruggedized in ways that German engineers could scarcely comprehend. The vacuum tubes were supported and braced with mechanical structures that bore no resemblance to conventional radio tube construction. The circuits were arranged to minimize electrical interference and maximize reliability. The battery was designed to function across temperature ranges from 100 degrees Fahrenheit to -50 degrees Fahrenheit. German technical assessment teams worked frantically to reverse engineer the device. They photographed every component. They measured every dimension. They tested the vacuum tubes to understand their construction. They analyzed the circuit designs to comprehend the engineering principles. Within days, a report was submitted to the German High Command. The conclusion was stark and devastating. The Germans could not duplicate this technology. The technical barriers were not simply matters of engineering talent or theoretical understanding. They were fundamental issues of industrial capacity and manufacturing precision. To manufacture proximity fuses in quantity, a nation would need to maintain production facilities capable of producing vacuum tubes with tolerances that had never been achieved in German manufacturing. The electrical components would need to be assembled by workers trained in a level of precision manufacturing that German industry had never developed. The production machinery would need to be manufactured specifically for this purpose, and such machinery did not exist in Germany. Most critically, the raw materials required for mass production, particularly high-quality quartz crystals used in frequency control and certain rare elements essential for precision manufacturing, were either unavailable in German territories or already dedicated to other military programs. A formal assessment by the German military hierarchy concluded that to duplicate American proximity fuse production would require 30 new specialized factories. These factories would need to employ 50,000 trained workers in precision manufacturing. The financial investment would equal the entire annual budget of the Luftwaffe. And even with unlimited resources, unlimited time, and unlimited labor, German industrial infrastructure would require years to achieve production rates that American factories had already reached. What made this calculation even more devastating was the realization that Germany had abandoned proximity fuse research in 1941. A Hitler directive that mandated the cancellation of all weapons projects requiring more than 6 months to production had terminated German proximity fuse development at a critical moment. German engineers had actually been pursuing multiple proximity fuse designs with some promise. The Rheinmetall-Borsig electrostatic fuse had achieved 80% reliability in laboratory testing, eventually reaching 95% reliability. The chronic acoustic proximity fuse used a mechanical tone filter connected to a resonating reed switch, detecting targets by analyzing sound reflections from engine noise. Had development continued, Germany might have fielded operational proximity fuses by 1942. But Hitler's decree had ended the research. When the war situation became critical and priorities were reconsidered, it was too late. American factories were already producing proximity fuses by the hundreds of thousands. German industrial capacity could not suddenly reverse direction and begin the massive retooling required to compete. The V-1 campaign continued through the summer and into early autumn of 1944. With each passing week, American production of proximity fuses increased. By August, American factories were producing approximately 40,000 proximity fuses daily across 5 major production centers. By December, production had peaked at approximately 70,000 fuses daily. The absolute numbers were staggering. More than 22 million proximity fuses were manufactured during the war. The impact on the V-1 campaign was unmistakable. In the first week of attacks, approximately 17% of V-1s entering the British gun belt were destroyed. By the end of August, that figure had reached 74%. On the last day of the major V-1 campaign, only 4 of 104 flying bombs succeeded in reaching their targets. General Frederick Pyle, commander of the British anti-aircraft defense, calculated that without the proximity fuse, civilian casualties from V-1 attacks would have been 4 to 5 times higher. London would have suffered devastation comparable to the Blitz of 1940. Instead, the city was spared a catastrophe through American technological innovation and industrial production. The proximity fuse's impact extended far beyond defense against V-1s. When the Allies crossed the Rhine in March 1945, American artillery equipped with proximity fuses revolutionized ground combat. Infantry advancing behind artillery bombardment suddenly found that their supporting fire was more accurate, more effective, and more rapidly responsive to changing tactical situations. Tank commanders using proximity-fused shells discovered that their direct fire weapons could achieve devastation previously reserved for bombers and fighter aircraft. The psychological effect on German soldiers was profound. Artillery, which had historically been a somewhat predictable threat, suddenly became a 24-hour menace that appeared without warning and struck with devastating precision regardless of weather or visibility. The German army's traditional tactic of moving during poor weather to escape. Allied air attack became dangerously ineffective. American artillery equipped with proximity fuses could now deliver effective fire in rain, fog, and darkness. During the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944, American forces used approximately 200,000 proximity-fused shells. The tactical transformation was evident in the casualty rates. German attacks that in previous years might have achieved breakthrough success instead encountered overwhelming defensive fire, arriving with impossible speed and accuracy. Field Marshal Walter Model's final communications before communication systems collapsed revealed the complete breakdown of German command and control. German units became isolated from each other and from higher headquarters. The American advantage was not simply numerical or positional. It was informational and coordinated. American commanders could concentrate overwhelming artillery fire at critical points because their communication networks allowed them to direct fire from multiple batteries with precision that German artillery commanders could never match. The technological assessment that German officers prepared after examining captured proximity fuses contained an implicit acknowledgement of total defeat. The Americans had achieved something that transcended military advantage. They had created an entire ecosystem of warfare around technological principles that Germany could not duplicate. The resources required to match American industrial capacity did not exist. The skilled labor force that would have been necessary to manufacture proximity fuses in quantity was already committed to other desperate defensive projects. The raw materials were unavailable, and even if all these obstacles had been overcome somehow, the 6-month or 1-year development timeline required would have been too late. The war in Europe would have ended before German proximity fuses could have been manufactured in significant numbers and deployed in combat. German interrogation after the war revealed the complete scope of German proximity fuse research and the reasons for its failure. German scientists had actually developed more than 30 different approaches to proximity fuses, some remarkably sophisticated. The Rheinmetall-Borsig electrostatic design using capacitive detection showed genuine promise. The chronic acoustic design using mechanical resonance was theoretically sound. There were optical designs, magnetic designs, and experimental radio designs, but none had progressed beyond limited testing. The decision to terminate proximity fuse research in 1941 had been made by Hitler with the reasoning that any weapon project requiring more than 6 months to production was a waste of resources better devoted to immediate military needs. That decision, made in a moment of confidence when German military prospects seemed favorable, proved to be catastrophically wrong. By 1944, when the decision might have been reversed, it was far too late. The irony was profound and bitter. German engineers understood the physics and mathematics of proximity fuse design. German scientists possessed theoretical knowledge sufficient to develop the technology. German industry had manufactured complex electronic devices for radar and radio communication. German factories had demonstrated remarkable precision in producing military equipment. But German industrial capacity, when measured against American industrial capacity, was fundamentally inadequate for the task. To manufacture 22 million proximity fuses would have required the complete retooling of the German electronics industry. It would have required the dedication of resources from other critical military programs. It would have required a level of industrial coordination and planning that Nazi Germany, for all its ruthless efficiency in some areas, could not achieve. Germany was fighting a war against an enemy whose industrial capacity was fundamentally superior. This industrial advantage had translated itself into technological advantage precisely because the Americans possessed both the scientific knowledge to develop proximity fuses and the manufacturing capacity to produce them in unprecedented quantities. The final revelation came during the Ruhr Pocket encirclement in April 1945, when American forces used proximity-fused artillery to concentrate devastating firepower on German supply convoys and command centers. German units that had somehow survived Normandy, the Ardennes, and the Rhine crossing found themselves under bombardment from an enemy that seemed to operate with omniscient knowledge of their positions. What German commanders did not understand was that American forward observers equipped with CR-300 walkie-talkies were calling down artillery strikes with precision and speed that would have been impossible just months earlier. The combination of communication technology, artillery effectiveness, and operational coordination created a level of military integration that had never been achieved before. German soldiers began to grasp at some deep and almost spiritual level that they were not simply fighting against a better equipped enemy. They were fighting against an entire civilization that had organized itself around principles of technological integration and industrial production that Germany could neither match nor overcome. By August 1944, when the 82% kill rate against V-1s demonstrated to the world the effectiveness of the proximity fuse, the psychological impact in Germany was profound. Officers and soldiers who examined captured fuses or heard descriptions of their effectiveness experienced a moment of clarity, a sudden understanding that the war was being decided not by tactical brilliance or individual courage, but by industrial capacity and technological innovation. The proximity fuse was not the most advanced weapon of the war. The atomic bomb possessed greater destructive power. Jet aircraft represented more dramatic technological achievement. Guided missiles represented more sophisticated engineering. But the proximity fuse, precisely because it was produced in such vast quantities and so thoroughly integrated into the entire structure of artillery and anti-aircraft warfare, achieved an impact on the actual conduct of warfare that few other technologies matched. The V-1 campaign ended not with a final, dramatic victory, but with a gradual attrition as German launch sites were overrun and destroyed. The last flying bomb fell on England on March 27, 1945, more than 9 months after the first V-1 crossed the English coast. In that time, the proximity fuse had proven itself to be perhaps the most consequential technological innovation in anti-aircraft warfare. When General Eisenhower wrote his post-war assessment, he considered what might have happened if Germany had succeeded in perfecting and deploying proximity fuses 6 months earlier than the Allies. His conclusion was chilling. German anti-aircraft defenses equipped with proximity fuses might have made the Normandy landings unsustainable. German artillery using proximity fuses during the critical period of the Normandy breakout could have inflicted casualty rates that halted the entire Allied advance. The course of the entire war might have been fundamentally altered. The symbolic meaning of the proximity fuse transcended its military function. The fuse represented American capacity to take theoretical concepts and convert them into practical weapons through meticulous engineering and massive production. It represented the mobilization of American industrial civilization around scientific principles. It represented the ability of American factories, using American workers, many of them women and minorities previously excluded from industrial employment, to manufacture components of breathtaking miniaturization and precision at scales that seemed impossible. Over 100 million vacuum tubes were produced, each one a miracle of miniaturization and engineering. 87 different companies using 110 factories participated in the proximity fuse program, each one contributing specialized expertise and production capacity. The young scientist James Van Allen, who had pioneered the shock-resistant vacuum tubes that made the entire program possible, survived the war and returned to scientific research. He would go on to develop the instrumentation for America's first satellite, Explorer 1, and discover the radiation belts that encircle the Earth. The lessons he had learned developing proximity fuses, the requirements for miniaturization, for reliability under extreme conditions, for precision manufacturing, would directly influence his work in space exploration. The mousetrap spring innovation that had protected vacuum tube filaments against 20,000 times normal gravity would, in modified form, protect sensitive instruments carried to the edge of space. By October 1944, the V-1 threat had been essentially neutralized. Of the 9,300 flying bombs launched by Germany against England between June and the end of August, only approximately 2,500 had reached London. The rest were destroyed by fighter aircraft, anti-aircraft artillery, or mechanical failures. Civilian casualties, while tragic, over 6,000 people were killed, were far lower than German planners had anticipated. Without the proximity fuse, casualties would have approached 100,000. Thousands of additional homes would have been destroyed. London's civilian population might have collapsed under the psychological pressure of sustained bombardment without effective defense. The German military assessment of the proximity fuse situation, compiled by technical officers and submitted to the High Command, contained a single clear message. Germany could not match this technology. The assessment was correct. Germany did not possess the industrial capacity, the manufacturing expertise, the raw materials, or the time to develop and produce proximity fuses in sufficient quantities to affect the outcome of the war. The proximity fuse represented a technological gap that could not be closed through German ingenuity or determination. It represented instead a fundamental disparity in industrial civilization between the competing powers. Catherine, sitting at her radar console in the Dover bunker, watching the green phosphorescent blips representing V-1s vanish at an unprecedented rate, did not understand the technical specifications of the proximity fuse. She did not know the story of James Van Allen and his work with vacuum tubes. She did not comprehend the industrial production statistics or the technical limitations that prevented Germany from duplicating the technology. She understood only what she saw on her screen, that the defensive system that had seemed so inadequate weeks earlier had been transformed into something devastatingly effective. The transformation had occurred not through tactical innovation or inspired leadership, but through the application of American scientific knowledge and manufacturing capacity. The 82% kill rate that seemed impossible was simply the inevitable result of American industry being mobilized to solve a specific technical problem with unlimited resources and time. The Germans had asked themselves if a proximity fuse was possible. They had calculated that it was not. The Americans had asked themselves the same question and answered that it was possible, and then they had built the factories and trained the workers and produced the components to make it real. In the end, the question was not whether a proximity fuse could be built. The question was which civilization possessed the industrial capacity to build it in the quantities required for victory.